thing that always intrigued me about it, Seth, was it's one of the few industries now that kind of builds something of lasting value that 20, 30 years from now, you can kind of drive by. My dad would drive by and point to things that he built 10 years ago and, very proud of it, but it has kind of lasting value compared to a lot of things that we learned in business school, like financial products and, kind of smoke and mirror kind of businesses that are maybe service related, but they didn't create anything of real tangible value.
I'm trying to be constructive instead of destructive. And I feel like there is a pretty interesting distinction there. There's a lot of people in the world that like to break things apart and break it down. I like to see if I can build it up.
My experience with the family business, it's almost binary. It ends up working really, really well, or it ends up being a terrible disaster.
In my book, this all comes down to the physical things being built, and there's somebody who has to do that, and we got to keep those people happy.
There's still some self-performing general contractors out there, but on average, general contractors, construction managers today, they subcontract everything. They are not builders, right? They manage risk, they manage contracts, they manage schedule. And ultimately, the builders end up being, the trade contractors, the people with labor that go out and, site work and, the concrete. But that's changed in the industry. I think that's created some challenges. You can either be the Nordstroms and you're going to compete on value and you're going to deal with a different set of buyers and segments of the industry, or you can be the Walmart and you can do hard bid, municipal work. In my 39 years in the industry, if I look at really what I would consider to be meaningful changes that have really impacted the industry, it's really interesting. Most of those, I think, have been driven by owners.
Kind of approaching this thing from the owner perspective and really want to help the owner. But I think this is the part that I'm excited to talk to you about, is I think owner and laborer need to kind of come together. I'd love for you to tell any version, length of your background story that you're willing to, but maybe start from the beginning. What was your first exposure to this industry? Did you grow up as a kid liking it? How did you get into it?
Yeah, good question. I actually grew up right outside of Tampa here, just east of where my office is today, but grew up in a family. My dad was an estimator for a masonry contracting firm for a long, long time. Kind of got exposed to the industry through that. Ended up going to college right here at the University of South Florida in Tampa. I got out in 1984, my undergraduate degree in business, and looked around at the jobs my friends were getting. And they weren't, they weren't too inspiring. The economy wasn't great at that time. So I actually went and hid in graduate school for a few years and got my MBA at University of South Florida. Got out. My dad was smart enough not to hire me. I was smart enough not to go to work for my dad, but I love being around the industry. The thing that always intrigued me about it, Seth, was it's one of the few industries now that kind of builds something of lasting value that 20, 30 years from now, you can kind of drive by. My dad would drive by and point to things that he built 10 years ago and, very proud of it, but it has kind of lasting value compared to a lot of things that we learned in business school, like financial products and, kind of smoke and mirror kind of businesses that are maybe service related, but they didn't create anything of real tangible value. And right out of graduate school, I kind of stumbled into a couple of my classmates were interviewing with FMI at the time. Ran into one of them one evening at the mall, I think, and said, hey, if you have an interview to talk to these guys, you should talk to them. So I got hooked up with FMI 87, interviewed with them, came to work for them. And at the time, we were a pretty small organization. And at the time, our model was a little bit different. We would kind of hire freshly minted MBAs like myself, not a lot of industry experience, but we'd kind of staple them to the hip of one of our senior people, and they would travel around. And one day they might be helping a contractor with strategic kind of stuff. The next day they might be working on operational things. You might be helping them with compensation. So you were kind of a generalist, a business generalist. And so I kind of got some broad exposure and started to learn a little bit about the construction industry and the nuance of contracting and construction and how it's a little bit different kind of business. So that was kind of how I got my starts with FMI in 1987.
Before you move on from the early history, tell me about, you just briefly mentioned, didn't go into the family business exactly, going to work for your dad. And I know you probably have stories about that too, about why you're grateful you never did that in the first place. But talk about that, like family businesses in our industry. Do you think I'm sure it's a mixed bag, but what's your general opinion about keeping things in the family?
Yeah, my dad actually worked for somebody else, so it wasn't his business. But with that said, a lot of our clients, Seth, I'm guessing probably 40% of my clients are family businesses somehow.
Right.
Matter of fact, I was just with a contractor this week. Dad started the business probably back in the 60s, 70s. The two sons have kind of come in and taken over the business, but we have an opportunity to work for a lot of family businesses. My experience with the family business, it's almost binary. It ends up working really, really well, or it ends up being a terrible disaster. And
Yeah.
so I've got a lot of opinions and insights and war stories from family businesses. But in
I
some
hope we
cases,
do also
yeah,
get to kind of contrast that with like maybe the other end of that pendulum is like private equity just kind of going crazy and creating chaos in M&A. I don't know which side of that pendulum you prefer. Investors doing their bottom line driven thing or families getting into drama, you know?
yeah, yeah. There's definitely advantage, pros, and cons of each, and it's always an interesting dynamic when there's two siblings in the business. That's usually a unique dynamic. Usually, one of them is really running and controlling, having an impact on the business. The other one's oftentimes along for the ride, but it can work. It can work really well. I've seen second generation, third generation actually take businesses to the next level, and I've seen them, run it in the ground. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of experience there. So
Okay, again, I mean, you got to FMI so early in your career. I hate doing this because it makes it seem like I'm aging you, but I did notice you say you graduated your bachelor's in '84, and I'm like, you started your career when I was born, which is kind of a cool thing for me. Like, I was born in '84. I spent a while getting through my education, so 22 years before I got into the industry after that. But it just makes me think like generationally. That's kind of cool to me. You were getting started on your career. I was being born. You're ahead of me like by 22 years. But in any case, I kind of want you to talk about you've been there your whole career now. And what is FMI just for people who maybe have never heard of it? It seems like a pretty broad scope of services they can offer. So tell
yeah, it is, and it's interesting. I think our generation, and actually, my parents' generation, it was more likely somebody would go to work somewhere and have a 35, 40-year career there. My generation, probably a little rare. I will tell you at FMI, there's a number of people like me that have kind of come and spent their entire career here. We kind of joke that once you've been here 5 years, you're pretty much unemployable anywhere else. Really unique company. But a little bit about the company from a high level, and I'll try to make this as quick as I can. But there's two sides to our business. We're based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm actually in our Tampa office. We have an office in Houston and an office in Denver. Then we have a handful or so kind of remote employees that kind of sprinkle throughout the country that kind of report back to one of those offices. But we kind of look at our business, Seth, really uniquely. So one side of our business is our FMI capital advisors. So think of M&A activity, anything transactional, buying, selling, and it could be buying or selling with private equity. It could involve a strategic buyer. It could involve a sale to a group of 4 or 5 internal managers or leaders. Or today, the hot model right now is the ESOP. But anything to do with transfer of stock ownership, that group gets involved with. Generally, that side of our business is typically 50% of our revenue or so. They kind of continue to be about half of our business right now. I would say most of their work is seller rep. Selling, representing sellers, people that are exiting the business. Guys like myself that are baby boomers that have been in it for a while that are looking for an exit. The buyers are strategic. You mentioned private equity, spending a ton of money in the sector right now. And then ESOPs have been pretty hot. So that group kind of does those kind of transactional kind of things. And then the side of the business I'm on is our consulting business. And think of kind of traditional management consulting. So we've got, strategic planning. They're kind of married up with a pretty robust research group. We do a lot of industry research. You might read some of our publications that we put out periodically on construction spending and trends. But that group primarily works with people in the built environment. Most of our clients are contractors, but we do a fair amount of work in the building products. Anybody that sells their products to contractors. Do a little bit of work in AE space. That's not a big sector of where we operate. I'm in a group called the performance practice. Most of what we're doing in there is operational improvement. So working with typically very labor intensive, self-performing trade contractors, helping them get better at managing the largest controllable cost in their business, which happens to be labor, and kind of as labor goes, their business goes. We've got a group that does compensation consulting, designing incentive comp plans. Think of salary benchmarking, benefits benchmarking, anything related to compensation or benefits. And then the third kind of leg of the stool is our leadership and organizational development. So soft skills, leader development, training, organizational development kind of work. They do a fair amount of management succession, helping people get, figure out who's the next generation of leaders to run this business, helping current leaders get that next group developed and ready to kind of run the business going forward. Not the transactional piece of ownership, but more who's going to be the next generation of senior leaders in the business. They do a lot of that kind of work. And then stacked on all of that, we've got about 40 active peer groups of various trades. Think of 6 to 8 non-competing companies, very similar, maybe trade from different parts of the country, get together several times a year, share everything from financial performance to best practices. And then most of the senior people like myself at kind of a shareholder or director level, most of us are involved in a number of boards. I'm currently on 4 ESOP boards where I've got kind of a fiduciary role. And then I'm on 3 or 4 just pure advisory boards where I sit on the board of directors, but I don't really have a vote. So, that's kind of a high level.
Totally.
Yeah, high level summary of what we do and different things that we do. Between that, we're not builders. We don't get into the nuts and bolts. We're not technical. We really kind of get into more of the management and leadership and understanding, what really drives and grows, what really drives value in a construction firm, and helping our clients really grow the value of their firms is really. So, we think of it kind of as a life cycle. We can help you if you want to get into the business through acquisition. We can help you grow value through our consulting services. And then on the tail end, when you're ready to exit the business, again, we go back to our, investment banking side of the business, and they can help you exit the business. So that's kind of, in a big picture, how we kind of envision, the life cycle of a contractor and how we have a relationship with them kind of through that whole life cycle.
Yeah, again, I'm relatively new even to the M&A side of construction and the money side of it. I've been the guy in job trailers with the computer, basically. I'm the PM, like not the laborer, but the guy that's out on site, just not swinging any hammers. But been more in those like higher level business discussions lately. So it's endlessly interesting to me how companies are built and organized in this industry, maybe especially the actual builders. Something I think about a lot is there's a lot of people in our industry who aren't designing or building buildings anymore. And that's a problem, in my opinion. Sure, I just think we can work on it. But in any case, the way people organize businesses, especially like a general contractor or somebody who has the labor piece of this industry, like how should those companies be set up to keep those people happy? Because in my book, this all comes down to like the physical things being built, and there's somebody who has to do that, and we got to keep those people happy. And I'm hearing, I don't know for sure. It seems like suicide is more common than the most common cause of death in our industry is from suicide, not from workplace dangers. But so I'm just curious, like it feels to me like and I'm new to it, like I was saying, but there seems to be fads. Like sometimes it's all about employee ownership, sometimes. And yeah, ESOPs got popular, and then I hear a lot of downsides. Is it like that where ideas come and they get popular and then a new idea comes, and or is there really good ways to set up a business that we know and you should all do it that way, or it's just kind of cater to your personal situation?
Yeah, we're a very fragmented industry, and to some degree that creates some challenges for industries. Just literally hundreds of thousands. I don't know how many contractors are in the U.S., but if you included all the the mom and pop up to the the NR top 100, you're probably looking at hundreds of thousands of contractors, and then you've got general contractors, you've got every trade. So it's a very fragmented industry, and I'm not sure there's any one right or wrong model, but there I think there's fundamentals that kind of survive the test of time of what grows value in a construction firm. And I'll full disclosure, I am very much trade contractor focused in our business. I'm kind of the one of the people that does a lot of work with the trade contractors. We've got other people that spend most of their time with the general contractors, construction managers. Really different businesses, and the things that drive those businesses are uniquely different. But I think there's some things that stand the test of time that were the right things back in the late 80s when I got into the business that are still fundamental today. But I think there's also trends that kind of come and go through the business based on the world changing. And a good example, Seth, is when I got into this business late 80s, early 90s, most general contractors at that time actually self-performed a fair chunk of work, right? They would typically do concrete, they would do some carpentry, framing, but they often did things that were kind of on the critical path of the project. And they were builders. They understood managing labor, they understood productivity. But one of the trends that I've just seen over the years is, on average, and there's obviously exceptions to this, there's still some self-performing general contractors out there, but on average, general contractors, construction managers today, they subcontract everything. They are not builders, right? They manage risk, they manage contracts, they manage schedule. And ultimately, the builders end up being, the trade contractors, the people with labor that go out and, site work and, the concrete. But that's changed in the industry. I think that's created some challenges because you've got general contractors who have certain things that kind of drive the success of their business. And sometimes I think those are almost maybe at odds with the trade contractors who, again, as a trade contractor, they live and die by their ability to manage labor and manage productivity, right? If they estimate on a large project that it's going to take $5 million worth of labor to produce it, if they end up spending 10, 15% more and spend, whatever that is, 5,500,000 labor, at the margins we operate, they're in trouble. And so general contractors who don't manage labor don't really understand kind of sometimes how, when they do certain things or don't do certain things on project, how it really has impact downstream on the trade contractors, because they're just they're really different businesses.
I can imagine a future too. Like the company I'm with now is very much of the mindset someday AI will design buildings and robots will build them. We don't know how long into the future that is, but I can imagine a closer, more near future where AI does a lot of the designing and robots might do some of the building. But my guess is like consulting kind of goes away because AI can basically consult the owner now, I think. And you could basically have an owner just kind of ideating over a project he wants and get most of it designed and organized, and the team could get organized without much consulting, but there will still be a labor piece, which I think is a subcontractor.
Absolutely.
That owner maybe has enough intelligence in their tech system to just like contract everything. Think about it out loud, use an LLM to create bid docs, send them out and I think it would go straight to subcontractors in that near future. Do you see that happening before some other iteration?
Yeah, I tell you what, I'm kind of excited, even as a guy, as a baby boomer and kind of later in my career as an industry, I think we have been way behind the curve in terms of adoption and use of technology to improve our business. I think we're in a new time. I think that's changing dramatically. Kind of living in the part of the world that you live out in, you're on the West Coast there, but you see all the businesses popping up, and the amount of money and venture capital being spent on technology in the construction industry is just, it's off the chart, which is good. And I guess like anything there, we're seeing some of that technology having real meaningful impact in terms of value proposition. But I think you're going to continue to see in the next 5 years just transformational change based on technology, not just AI, but technology and software and all that stuff is going to, I think, kind of bring us into a new generation. I think you're always going to have kind of we've always predicted this, and it's true. You're going to end up with kind of a bifurcated market where on one end you're going to have sophisticated owners. We call them serial owners, people that have, they're building all the time, right? Every year they have a capital budget, but think of big hospitals and people, universities that are constantly going to have capital projects going on that are going to become more and more sophisticated. You're going to have contractors that operate in that world. I think those owners are going to drive a lot of the change. But I think you're also going to have kind of the one-off developers, people that build one building every 10 years. They're not, doing it consistently, that are going to probably stay like the more traditional markets. There's going to be less adoption of technology, probably less change from kind of the traditional model. That'll end up being kind of a commodity market where people just go in and low bidder gets stuff, and kind of the Walmarts of the world. As long as you can be the low cost producer, and buy really well and manage productivity well, you can do okay. But I think you're going to see the market change, and you're always going to have two markets, one on the top end that I think is going to be much more sophisticated, driven with technology, more eager to adopt technology. And, in my 39 years in the industry, if I look at really what I would consider to be meaningful changes that have really impacted the industry, it's really interesting. Most of those, I think, have been driven by owners. I found that general contractors, if an owner's asking them to do something or kind of demanding it, they'll get interested in doing it, but left on their own, they're just typically not going to make those kind of investments. And so, if you look at safety, for example, if you want to see really who's kind of driven safety in our industry, go to the industrial world. People in the petrochem, heavy industrial, those owners years ago just became just emphatic about, if you're going to work on our jobs, your safety is going to, it's going to be completely different. So, I think eventually that started to kind of migrate over a little bit into the commercial and the building world and that kind of stuff. But generally, a lot of the trends that I've seen that have been helpful to our industry, they've really started from owners just saying, hey, we're going to change something or going to do something different. Some of the big hospital chains right now, out on the West Coast, you've got Sutter Healthcare, you've got some of these big guys, but they're really driving prefabrication. They're really driving modularization. But a lot of those trends are kind of starting from some of the big healthcare people who spend billions and billions every year.
Totally.
Yeah.
Why do you think, though, like what my premise of that question was kind of, I think the trade contractors are going to survive possibly longer than everybody else. Do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I think they have, and it's really being exacerbated right now with all of the hyperscale projects and the mega projects that are just consuming all of the labor. But I've always scratched my head wondering why the trade contractors, who have the most valuable resource needed to get a project built, people, right, labor, talent, trades, how they haven't leveraged that. And I think that's starting to happen, but to me, the people that have the most, the resource that's in the most demand, the most valuable resource, people, ultimately at the end of the day should be the ones starting to kind of drive changes and have a little bit more leverage.
Yeah. Is there anybody else on a construction project that if that whole group said, we're not going to do it anymore, it wouldn't happen? Like I think you could say trade contractors are that group, right?
Yeah, I think the challenge, though, is like I said, there's literally hundreds of thousands of companies out there. And, I think there's kind of this owner mentality, or sometimes a general contractor mentality as well. If they don't want to play by our rules, there'll be somebody, there'll be 5 people behind them that are interested in talking to us. But I would say on the higher end, the more sophisticated projects, the more challenging projects, the more where, big pools of labor are needed. I'm starting to see the trade contractors begin to kind of, be a little bit more assertive in terms of what they're going to do and what they're not going to do, being selective in what kind of projects they're going to pursue. Heck, if you just look at the contracts that they're being asked to sign by general contractors today, most general contractors would tell you they wouldn't sign their own contract, right? And so I think on the upper end, we're starting to see that where some of the more sophisticated trade contractors are becoming a little bit more in control of their own destiny, right? There's certain things they're not going to do. Here's the kind of people we want to align with. Here's the value system that we want to work with. And, they're starting to have a little bit more leverage and control some of the shots with that, I think. But
What
that isn't going
were
to happen across the industry. There's always going to be the commodity buyers that are going to buy low price.
Mm.
And there's going to be the commodity contractors that can only compete on price because they really don't have a compelling value proposition. When you ask them, hey, beyond your price, what do you bring to the table? They don't have a compelling story. So, but the trade contractors that are heavy into innovation, prefab, modularization, they have something else to talk about other than their price. And general contractors that are competing on certain types and scales of projects, they're interested in listening to that because that allows them to take some new ideas to the owners and kind of sell some different ideas to the owner upstream.
Yeah, I worked at well, I guess I don't know if you'd call it a trade subcontractor. It was a structural glazing EPC company as a PM. And yeah, they would have manufacturing in China and Turkey of glass, and then fabricating steel in Wisconsin, and almost all of our projects were in San Francisco where I was. But it did just make me think, like, these guys know how to accomplish this, and their differentiator was these are maybe the hugest pieces of glass. Like, we're not talking about windows, So it was like they're one of the few people manufacturing that size of glass supported by that kind of steel structure. And it was kind of funny because, like, when one of those pieces of glass broke, they didn't have very many other people to call.
There you go.
You know what
There
I'm
you go.
saying? And it is an advantage if nobody else can do that thing.
Yeah, and you kind of bring up a point, Seth, that again, I think it's one of the things that has attracted me to working with the trade contractors and just kind of attracted me to the industry. But trade contractors are incredible problem solvers. At the end of the day, if you look at the quality of plans and specs that they're having to bid from, it's half baked. And on bid day, they're having to kind of bid on that. But ultimately, they're having to build something from this. And at the end of the day, you know, the trade contractors are the ones that are kind of responsible for, hey, you got to kind of figure this out and make it work in the field. And I was having a discussion a couple of weeks ago with a client of mine just about kind of how resilient the trade contractors are and how they just seem to solve it. Somehow they have to end up getting the project built and they figure it out. But we were reflecting back to like March of 2020. I don't know, if I vividly remember kind of when COVID, hit. We kind of had, I don't remember the exact day, but it was in mid-March. But it was like, holy crap, projects are getting shut down. Our business depends on us being traveling and being in our clients' offices a lot of times. It's like, holy crap, you can't get on an airplane. How's the world going to survive? Well, within a week, if you think about it, at that point, nobody had ever heard of Zoom. Nobody had ever heard of Teams. We had no idea what that was. But within a week, you had contractors that had figured out how to get people set up at home. They got their 2 monitors. They were figuring out how to get people safely onto a job site and distance and meet all those requirements with masks and all the stuff we had to do. But, and there were some states that, it was more impactful. But generally speaking, the industry within a week or two, many of them were back in business and getting stuff built and hitting schedules. And to me, just kind of watching how the industry, we're kind of faced with a problem one day of, what does this mean for all of us? And within a week, people kind of figured out how to navigate that. But that just kind of amazed me about our industry of how quick we were able to kind of pivot and, talk about throwing a rock in the road. But again, in most places, and the exception with states that almost closed, jobs down, other places, figured out how to move on. I actually had clients that some of the best years they had were during COVID. And I'm like, that's unbelievable. But
Totally.
incredibly resilient, and again, that just speaks to kind of just the grit, the problem solving, trade contractors, they figure it out. Somehow they get it done.
It's so true. And I saw it in practice so many times throughout my career where it's like I'm looking at drawings and then looking at the site and then looking at the materials that just arrived. And I'm like, wait, this isn't even right. Like, how is that going to do that? And what is going to happen with that? And then the foreman comes up, or one of the laborers just starts putting the thing together. And like, I'm like, what about these centimeter, millimeter tolerances? And they're like, just, I mean, not saying they always cut corners or anything, but they have to jerry rig stuff to get these things built. Like, people don't understand how hard it is. I don't think architects understand how hard it is to do what they've drawn. You know what I'm saying? It's just crazy.
Complexity, complexity of buildings today, just the amount of things that go into a building, the complexity, the technology that's going into building, the MEP systems today are just incredibly sophisticated, smart buildings and how do you make all that fit? How do you eliminate all the conflicts and the
Yeah.
disruptions and things? But yeah, it's an amazing industry in terms of being able to kind of solve problems. And I know,
I spent I spent some time selling paver driveways to people and getting pretty close to the labor of that work too. And so I would be there, I would go knock on people's doors and talk to them about, do you want a new driveway? And I was a decent salesperson, but at the end, like, it always gets to a point where they're like, well, tell me how much. And then they go crazy. They're like, $20,000 for my driveway and backyard or whatever. And they're just like, I don't like, those pavers cost $2 per square foot or whatever. They look it up at Home Depot, and I'm like, do you not understand? Like, we don't just throw the pavers in your driveway. And then
exactly.
I would watch these guys go out there and do the work. And now I'm actually trying to do some hardscaping at my home by myself. And I'm like, dang, I even know how to do this. And it's just funny because I actually thought of it as like, instead of a gym, I'm going to do a bunch of yard work all the time, And
There you go.
and so I'm purposefully doing as much manual labor as possible. Like, I got a tamper and started doing some hand compaction, and it's fun. But it was like, this experiment for me reminds me back to the times that I would get mad at our laborers for doing something that didn't look right or whatever. And I just have so much more empathy. I bet you have this too. So like, I'm kind of approaching this thing from the owner perspective too. I've been in owner's rep roles for the past 8 years or so, and really want to help the owner. But I think this is the part that I'm excited to talk to you about, is I think owner and laborer need to kind of come together. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's just happened, if you look at a large complex project today, look at all the different stakeholders that are involved, right? You've got an owner, you could have an owner's rep, you could have a general contractor, you've got an architect, you've got consultants, subconsultants, you've got subcontractors, subcontractors. But the number of stakeholders involved in a project, when you start looking at the complexity of communication, the more you add stakeholders, you can begin to understand, why there's so many communication challenges on a project. But I know in one of, maybe the original conversation you and I had offline a few months ago, I remember talking a little bit in about, hey, if you were kind of in the owner seat, what would you think of differently? But one of the things that I really see, Seth, if I was an owner, and again, I was building large, sophisticated stuff, if you think about it, if you were trying to figure out the most productive, the most efficient, the most cost effective, the most functional, the safest way to build something, who would you ask, right? It's people that do it every day. And one of the problems or challenges that I see right now in this industry is you got an owner, they go out and hire a general contractor and designer, they do all their work. And classic case, I was with one of my fairly decent sized electrical contractor clients earlier this week. And they were talking about, they received a call last Thursday on a fairly significant project that you've been awarded the project. You got to be out there Monday. And my point is, as an owner, if I want to design and build something as efficiently and effectively and as safely as I could, one of the things I would figure out how to do is to get my key trade contractors on board earlier and deeper back in the design process. I'm a big proponent of design build, but my experience has been the earlier and deeper your key trade contractors are involved, the more constructible project you're going to have. The better probably plans and specs you're going to have. You're not going to have a designer producing something that the contractor can't build. But I'm a big fan of anything that gets the key trades, and you can't do this with every trade contractor on the job, but certainly things like MEP, in many cases, maybe your interior walls and framing guys, maybe concrete, and certainly anything that's kind of on the critical path. I would have them on board early in the design process and being part of how do we do this? Because quite frankly, a lot of the loss of productivity, a lot of the friction, a lot of the loss of schedule, I think, is the subcontractors, trying to build something off a half-baked set of plans, and they're running back upstream every day trying to get RFIs answered, questions answered of things that aren't even constructible that they're trying to figure out a workaround or a solution to. That if they were involved earlier and deeper, I think on average you'd see much lower cost in terms of delivery projects. I think you'd see schedule durations dramatically reduce. But I think there's a disconnect there is we just bring on the people who really understand how to build what you're trying to build. We bring them on at the last minute, and then we kind of throw them into the fire, with a half-baked set of documents and plans, and under live fire. They got the general contractor on them, and somebody from their office is chasing them about the budget every week, and making sure they're productive. But they're thrown in the fire, and then we kind of wonder why projects struggle and don't get built on time. But to me, I'm also a big fan of kind of the old model of the master builder, where you go out and hire somebody to design it, build it. There's one throat to choke, but you don't have all these different stakeholders that are kind of pointing fingers and blaming the other guy. But I'm a big believer in that.
I have a bunch of being, like you said, in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley area. I have friends who many of which went into tech, and I remember back, like I was in CM and I had a bunch of software engineer friends that studied that and left and watched their careers and felt like, man, I'm missing out. Like they're making tons of money, and some of them that, especially the ones that were building or working with SaaS companies, are now like, you know what, Seth, I should go buy a mechanical subcontractor. And I'm like, interesting that you would identify it. I don't want tons of people who have no knowledge of this industry being like, let me just go buy a trade contractor. But I do think it is kind of a good business model right now. Do you agree? And how would you, let's say you wanted to do something like that successfully. It's not like just willy-nilly, hey, I come from tech, I'm going to AI the business administrative side of a mechanical contractor, and then it'll be great. What advice would you have?
Yeah, construction. I've got an MBA, and most of the case studies and most of the coursework in the MBA program was always designed around manufacturers and service kind of businesses. And when you get into construction, it's different. You're not manufacturing the same F-150 down a assembly line that doesn't change every day, and you're in an environment that's changing. What you're building is different. And, there's some process and consistency to the process, but it is a uniquely nuanced kind of business. And you're seeing a lot of private equity get into the business, and quite frankly, it's good for us because we end up having to be a translator between construction and private equity. You've got really smart financial minds, but they don't understand the nuance of construction. They don't understand how can you sell a widget on bid day for 20% margin, and when it's all over, it only came in at an 8% margin. But there's the percent complete accounting and how you recognize earned revenue. Those are all kind of unique to our industry. But I've got a lot of examples where smart business people that didn't have construction background, got into the construction business, but they darn sure hired and made sure they had really good field people that understood how to build things. They really had really good project managers, understood, construction and the nuance of managing it. And as long as you've got kind of the right resources and right skill sets on your team. But I think it's also one of those industries where it looks a lot easier from the outside in. It's a high risk business. And especially these trade contractors with that labor on these big hyperscale projects. I've got mechanical and electrical clients that are doing $100 million electrical contracts on one project. And, for electrical contractor on a $100 million project, he's probably spending somewhere in the million or 30 range of 30 million on field labor. What if it ends up being 33 million? Again, the risk, and it could be somebody else's fault as to why the project runs long or why it's not productive. It could be a poorly coordinated project by the GC or, slow decision making by an owner, but it's a high risk, and it's not It's certainly not for everyone. And again, the people that I see that do consistently well over time, they're kind of unique people. They've got a lot of grit. They're competitive. They never, they somehow always figure it out. But it is a
Yeah.
truly unique breed of character that runs a successful trade contracting business over a long period of time. But they're unique individuals, and
I imagine,
they're unicorns.
right.
They
No,
are.
I agree with you. I imagine, though, that it's very easy to get busy and stay busy as a trade contractor. I feel like there's a big distinction between like finding a way to compound wins and value over time instead of just like, man, we've got tons of work and we're bringing in plenty of revenue, but who knows if we're pulling in a profit, is that a big distinguishing?
Yeah, I think and that's kind of the market we try to work with is kind of higher end. We want to work with industry leaders and help them pull the market forward. And I always say we work with good companies to try to help them become great companies, and then we work with great companies to help them become kind of greater companies. We don't do a lot of work with jacked up companies to fix. That's not our business, is doing turnaround work. But it seems to me the key is you've got to find something other than price to compete on, right? And it could be speed. It and a lot of times that's what's driving, the prefab kind of world is how do we get a project delivered? You know, Somewhere recently I read what one of these average, mega hyperscale data centers, the revenue that they are able to produce in a month when that data center is open, it's an insane amount of money. But as contractors, if you can help them figure out how do we get this project delivered 30 days quicker, or if you're a hospital, how do we get butts in beds 30 days quicker? That's a huge value proposition that people will pay a premium to that. Like, Sutter, HCA, these big hospital chains, they can tell you almost to the penny that every day that hospital's open, how much revenue they generate per bed. And so things that you can sell in terms of speed, getting a building dried in, if you're in a cold, wet climate, but prefab exterior building panels and envelope, the ability to get a building roughed in or dried in a short period of time versus using traditional stick belt that might cause you to be exposed all winter, you can sell that and you don't necessarily have to compete in a low bid competitive environment. So the contractors that have a genuine value proposition and can really demonstrate that and really sell that, they can do well. But the contractors who just, hey, I submit a price and if I'm low, kind of the Walmart model versus the Nordstrom model, which to me is kind of the value. You can play on either end of the market. I've got clients who are successful doing one. The contractors that get in trouble are the ones that get stuck in the middle.
Hmm.
And they're really kind of a high value company, but they're trying to sell to the commodity buyer and
Right.
it doesn't work, or vice versa. They're a low cost producer and they're trying to sell to the value, people that want to buy value and buy something uniquely different. Those are the people that seem to get in trouble. So you can either be the Nordstroms and you're going to compete on value and you're going to deal with a different set of buyers and segments of the industry, or you can be the Walmart and you can do hard bid, municipal work, school work, whatever. And it's a different business. In that kind of business, you have to be the most productive guy in your market. You got to be a low cost producer, just like Walmart, right? Walmart's a very successful company, but if you look at their buying practices, they're all about how do we take cost out of the business? How do we be productive? So how do you negotiate with if you've ever tried to sell something to Walmart, they understand how to buy things at a better rate, which is kind of a different model than on the value end where you're trying to work off of relationships and predictability and you want certainty of delivery, those kind of things. So
Totally.
there's clients that operate well at both ends, but when you get caught in the middle, you're stuck.
I feel like I can think of a bunch more questions, but I kind of want to give you. I want to make this an opportunity for me to say I'm going to call you in 6 months or a year, and we're going to do an update. But did I forget? Like, I feel like we kind of covered the whole like. Do you imagine a future for this industry, and how would it look different? I feel like we did talk about that, but is there anything else like you want to add? I know we discussed things offline, and don't want to forget anything.
Yeah, a couple things that I see. I do think the industry is going to look a lot different, 5 to 10 years from now. I think technology, a lot of there's some really good technologies out there that have just like I talk about a value proposition for the trade contractors, I'm seeing the same with technology. I probably get 1 to 2 calls a week from somebody that's got some new technology for the construction industry, and it could be AI related. It might be a new ERP. And and I guess just like anything where there's a lot of money being thrown at it, a bunch of those, when you kind of spend a few minutes kind of digging around saying, all right, what problem are you solving? And what value does that have to the contractor? You eliminate some of them pretty quickly. It's kind of cool technology. You say, hey, that's neat, that's interesting, but at the end of the day, it's not really going to make the contractor more money. It's not going to reduce their risk profile. It's not going to deliver a project quicker. So there's a lot of them that I think are just, they're burning through other people's money. When you're venture capital or private equity, you're working on other people's money. But there's some great ones out there that I'm seeing. And I had just, in anticipation of our discussion, Dusty Robotics. They're one of my favorites, but these, automated robotic layout for job sites versus doing it the old school way. I've got a number of clients that are using that will tell you, here's how many dollars of layout labor it saves. Here's the quality issues it eliminates because it's accurate versus human error. But there's a bunch of these out here that I'm kind of tracking in your part of the world. There's a company called Tracked 3D. If you don't follow them, watch
We're
these.
partners now.
They're
part of our workflows too. We have a partnership with them so that we can always offer that to owners. We want reality capture. I do think that's going to make a difference.
Yeah. So one of the things that they are working on is the ability to kind of walk a job site with, 3D camera using AI and actually quantify what work has been put in place. I will tell you that if they're able to crack that code and be able to do that for mechanical, electrical, framing, drywall, and quantify what's in place, that'll be game changing in terms of a contractor being able to know where they're really at and what's really installed versus somebody saying, hey, I think we're 62% complete, right? They're going to know that. And so I think they've got some groundbreaking stuff. I'm starting to see on the estimating side some AI generated stuff that can do takeoffs. One of the challenges with that, if you talk to experienced estimators, AI can already kind of tell you, what's on a set of plans and quantify that. What it can't quite do really well yet, but I think eventually it'll be trained to, is tell you what's not on those plans that you're going to have to build. And if you miss it, it's going to kill you. And for mechanical guys, that actually is a big piece. It's not necessarily what's on the plans. It's what's not that you're going to have to do. So that's, but I think you're going to see break off. Yeah, you're going to see, there's no reason 5 years from now for people to be sitting there quantifying and counting what's on a digitized set of plans. That just doesn't make sense.
That's exactly right. And that's kind of why I'm at Zero RFI, by the way, is like I've done these PM jobs for 20 years now, and I've done a lot of it manually. I started my career actually in forensics, getting document discovery on failed construction projects way before AI. We were just doing like optical character recognition at the time. So I was scanning stuff, getting it into searchable documents, but like I've spent my whole career trying to help project manage construction projects, and there's a ton of manual data manipulation that's actually very error prone. And I think if the owner can figure out, we can create what I call, or Claude Anthropic would call, a low temperature deterministic workflow. That's not like we're just throwing the drawings in a chatbot and being like, how do you build this thing? No, like we're creating expert in the loop learnings for an AI system that's really a workflow. It's not just AI. It's we're telling it what to look at in order to interpret these other things. And so our pitch is basically, we think owners should have representation that spends less time in front of the computer. Basically, a lot of our task is turning a P6 schedule and a change order log, an RFI log, and some stuff from the design team into something that the owner can make good decisions with. Like, how do you translate that information into, now the owner can make a decision faster with better information? And I think so much of that can be automated from my perspective. If I'm just trying to help the owner make these decisions better and faster, I really should create automated workflows. I shouldn't be looking at that P6 schedule and then inputting something in some other report, because then I'm going to screw it up. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and again, I'm a little bit biased on the subcontractor side. I'm a little further away from the owner side in terms of understanding what works there. But on the contractor side, the first thing I look for is, will this technology have any impact on saving labor?
Mhm.
Smart barrel, pretty simple. That this thing is kind of it uses it's a biometric time clock. You sign into the job, it takes a picture of
Yeah.
you, and it says, "Yep, that's Seth. That's the same Seth that was here yesterday." And by the way, it's 7:06. He's clocking in, and when you leave, and so if you look at, if you've got a couple hundred people on a job site, and they're nobody shows up exactly at 7 and leaves at exactly 3:30 or whatever the time is, right? You've got all these fractions, but over time, there's huge labor dollars in terms of just tracking what time are you actually paying them for versus what's getting written down on a traditional time card or on an Excel spreadsheet. But there's some things like that that have impact on labor. I just read an interest. Somebody on LinkedIn within the last few days was commenting about, they just read. I thought he said it. I can't imagine this, but I thought he said 10,000 pages of construction documents, and it's like, there's nobody out there that's going to read and consume, and but the ability to kind of go through documents, some of the things like document crunch, and just some of the things that you can kind of go through all these documents quickly and pull out risk, identify conflict, identify problems, identify gray areas, things that somebody is reading and you're paying your attorney to do. I'm starting to see some real, anything heavily administrative. I think we're going to be able to take things out, but if we can take field labor out as well, huge opportunities there.
Thank you for bringing up those two. Episode 33 of Constructive has Albert from Smart Barrel, and I've had Josh Levy and Trent Miskelly from Document Crunch on as well. So if you're interested in hearing more about those startups or construction tech companies, not even really startups anymore, but go listen to those episodes. Love those
Albert's
companies.
always fun to listen to, isn't he? Albert's a character.
Oh my gosh.
He's a character. I love that guy.
I meet so many people by doing this where I'm just like, I'm interested in having them on my podcast, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to be your friend. He's one of those,
Albert is one of the most passionate guys about what he's doing, and it's kind of hard to replace passion, right? You don't have to be a great salesperson as long as you're passionate. People sense that. Another one, Sightline. They're out in your part of the world, but in terms of billing technology, and they've got some pretty strong value propositions around improving cash flow and collection time. There's certainly one that I looked at, but there's probably 6 or 8 that I'm pretty familiar with that are getting traction, and I've got clients that will tell me, hey, this has been good for our business, right? So
that's what you want. Yeah
absolutely.
Well, thanks again, Scott. Like I said, I'm going to probably bug you in 6 months or a year and try to get an update and do some more, because I think a lot's going to change too, and you might be a good guy to check in with.
No, I enjoyed the opportunity, Seth. If I can help you in any way, I love being on these podcasts and just kind of bantering around ideas, even if I don't I enjoy the conversation, just kind of thinking out loud in terms of where the industry could go or could be. I think there's so much opportunity for us. My vision is, I think because we're so fragmented, we'll never all be there, but I do think the leaders of this industry, are going to be much further down the road a year from now with all this AI and technology. But I'm seeing it, almost on a daily basis now, more adoption of this stuff. So thanks for having me. I hope this is valuable for your listeners.
I hope so too. I'm very glad to have you in this industry. Please stick around, and thanks for coming on. We'll talk soon.